The crimson sky of Forge World Scarros was a perpetual wound, weeping a toxic scarlet down upon the landscape below. Its horizon was not the soft curve of nature, but a jagged row of teeth, the spires of industrial cathedrals and colossal manufactorum stacks. They pierced the heavens like skeletal, accusatory fingers, blaming the very atmosphere that fed them with smog and pollution. The air itself was thick, heavy with the acrid smells of ozone, burnt metal, and the faint machine incense of Binharic prayers that had been offered up for 10,000 years. The sound of Scarros was a ceaseless symphony of servitude. The grinding of titanic gears, the steady, rhythmic slam of piston hammers like the heartbeat of a dying titan, and the whisper of a billion souls servicing a god that they had never seen. And then, during one seemingly endless work cycle, the sky shuddered. It was not the sound of thunder, nor the familiar roar of an engine. It was the sound of the fabric of reality being torn asunder. A strange streak of light, bearing neither the golden divinity of an imperial vessel nor the tainted green of a Xenos craft, slashed across the sky like a razor. It fell with a chaotic, flawed trajectory, as if the universe itself was trying to vomit forth something that did not belong. A terrifying shriek was followed by a cataclysmic impact that shook the rust-caked iron plains. And then, an unnatural silence fell over the daily din of the machines. Inside the twisted wreck of red and gold metal, there was only darkness and the flicker of dying sparks. A sharp pain lanced through Tony Stark's chest. A familiar sensation, but this time it was accompanied by a silence more terrifying than any explosion. The familiar voice of his AI companion was gone. He gasped for breath, his voice raspy in the confines of his shattered helmet. "Friday. Damage report. Friday. Respond." Only cold static answered him, the sound of absolute, profound isolation. An emergency servo pushed a mangled plate of metal away, and Tony staggered out, squinting in the dim red light of a truly alien world. Shards of broken armor clung to him like fractured bones. The faceplate was gone, exposing his face to the toxic air. He coughed violently, his eyes wide as he tried to process the impossible sight before him. Structures so tall they blotted out the sky, every surface adorned with the iconography of the skull and the cog. Machines the size of city blocks moved with a ponderous slowness, tended to by cybernetic beings, their pallid skin almost indistinguishable from their metallic implants. Everything carried a sense of ancient, crumbling greatness, of a golden age long since passed into decay. He muttered to himself, a strained effort to cling to sanity. Okay. Definitely not in Kansas anymore. He raised his partially armored hand, where holographic displays flickered with error codes before shorting out completely. He was cut off. He was stranded. Before he could even take another step, the ground around him vibrated with the tread of synchronized metallic feet. From out of the smoke and metal dust, Skitarii Rangers emerged. They did not run. They did not shout. They simply converged on his position, their movements a perfect clockwork horror, like a swarm of mechanical insects. Their radium carbines were raised in absolute unison, the barrels glowing with a sickly green luminescence. Dozens of crimson optic lenses glowed in the haze, all of them focused on him, analyzing, assessing, and condemning. Their silence was more menacing than any threat. These were not soldiers he had ever faced. They were flesh and bone puppets, instruments of a greater will. Then, as if by some unspoken command, the Skitarii ranks parted, forming a path. A tall figure approached in silence, each of its metallic footfalls echoing with authority. It was a being that seemed to have shed most of its humanity for the perfection of the machine. A crimson robe failed to conceal a body held aloft by an augmetic frame. A writhing nest of 6 mechadendrites, like metallic serpents, coiled over its back, their pincer and drill tips twitching softly. Its face was a flawless porcelain mask, with 2 glowing viridian optics that swept over Tony, not seeing him, but scanning him with invisible streams of data. Tony felt as if every molecule of his broken armor, every cell in his body, was being dissected by that gaze. He stood motionless, not out of fear, but because his genius mind was trying to compute a situation with no familiar variables. The figure stopped before him, its silence creating a pressure heavier than the planet's own atmosphere. And then it spoke. The voice did not come from its remaining human lips, but was synthesized and amplified through a brass vox emitter. Cold, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. You will state your Forge World of origin and authorization code. This technology bears no known mark of the cult Mechanicus. An explanation is required. The unfeeling command of Magos Dominar Korith hung in the heavy air, as cold as the metal that encased her. Tony Stark, though on the back foot, had not yet lost his one remaining weapon, his arrogance. He managed a smirk, a small act of defiance before this machine of authority. "Hey there," he said, his voice a little hoarse from the toxic atmosphere. "Tony Stark, genius, billionaire, philanthropist. Though I'm guessing the billionaire part might need some recalibration in wherever the hell this is. Let me guess. A steampunk convention gone horribly wrong?" Korith did not react to the sarcasm. To her, human humor was a form of data noise, a flaw in the flesh's crude wetware that was to be ignored. She was not a person to be persuaded or intimidated. Her sole interest lay in the anomalous technology clinging to the stranger's body. One of her mechadendrites snaked out, elegant and menacing as a serpent. Its metallic claws opened, not to attack, but to retrieve a piece of shoulder armor that had fallen from Tony's frame. The fragment sparked in protest as microscopic nanites attempted to reconnect to the main system, a futile gesture. Korith's viridian optics focused on the fragment. Her synthesized voice suddenly shifted. The coldness of command vanished, replaced by an almost reverent tone, a fanatical hunger. "Self-repairing microcircuitry," she whispered, the words sounding like a forbidden prayer. "Autonomous restoration protocols. This is not sanctioned technology." Her gaze swept over Tony again, lingering on the flickering, unstable arc reactor in his chest. A power source so compact, so efficient, it was blasphemous. She saw a man, but also a living relic, an unimaginable heresy. "You claim ownership of this technology?" she asked, her voice returning to its cold monotone, but now laced with a new tension. "You claim to be its artificer?" Tony saw a dangerous glint in those optic lenses, a fanaticism that could justify any atrocity in the name of knowledge. He knew that any wrong answer would lead to him being dissected, both physically and technologically. "I'm its custodian," he said carefully, "just looking to return it to its proper place." "Incorrect," Korith replied flatly. "The proper place for such technology is within the sacred vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, to be studied, revered, and sealed away. You will surrender all components and accompany us to Interrogation Chamber Delta." Just as she was about to signal the Skitarii to escort him away, the entire Forge world seemed to scream in agony. A piercing siren wailed from every spire, not the sound of a modern system, but a chaotic chorus of colossal horns, clanging bells, and synthesized shrieks of Binharic code. The ground trembled. Another mechanical voice, this one filled with panic, crackled through Korath's Vox system. Warning, stabilization protocols failing at auxiliary plasma conduit 9, unstable energy architecture, catastrophic overload predicted in 180 cycles. Korath froze, her mechadendrites twitching with agitation. To lose this Archotech specimen was a sacrilege, but to allow a plasma conduit to overload would annihilate a quarter of her Forge world. A larger, closer explosion rocked the area, followed by a wave of heat and pale blue light from one of the massive Manufactorum structures. She made a split-second decision, ordering her Skitarii to escort Tony toward a secure bunker, while she and her personal guard moved toward the unfolding disaster. As they neared Conduit 9, the scene was one of utter chaos. Tech priests, the supposed masters of the machine, were running in circles like panicked zealots. Some were splashing vials of sacred oils onto sparking control panels, the unguents only causing the electrical fires to flare higher. Others were desperately chanting Binharic hymns, their voices lost in the ever-loudening roar of the reactor. An elder priest shrieked, his voice cracking with fear, "The machine spirit is wroth. We have offended the Omnissiah. Recite the litany of appeasement." Tony, held fast between two Skitarii, looked upon the scene with an entirely different set of eyes. He didn't see an angry god. He saw flawed design, a failing coolant system, and an exponential thermal feedback loop. He saw physics, not faith. And he saw a solution. "Hey, red robes," he shouted, trying to be heard over the din. "You're making it worse. You need to decouple the secondary pressure valves and reroute the plasma flow to the emergency heat sinks." The tech priests stared at him, as if he had just spoken in the tongue of demons. Magos Korath turned, her optic lenses narrowing with fury. "Silence, heretic. Only the sacred rites may soothe the machine spirit. Your machine spirit is about to turn us all into a crater of molten glass." Tony roared, his desperation overriding his sense of self-preservation. "It's not a god, it's a reactor, and it's about to blow." A loud, piercing shriek erupted from the machine, and the blue light from the reactor became painfully bright. That was when Tony made his move. Channeling the last dregs of power to his right gauntlet, he activated the repulsor at its lowest setting, not to attack, but to create a directed electromagnetic pulse. The EMP momentarily shorted out the two Skitarii holding him, their augmetic bodies seizing and locking up. He had bought himself a precious second of freedom. He sprinted toward an auxiliary control panel that the other tech priests were too terrified to approach. Its screen displayed ancient technical symbols, but to Tony, they were as easy to read as a physics textbook. "Bad design," he muttered. "Who puts the thermal regulator right next to the primary exhaust?" He did not pray. He did not chant. He ripped a panel of metal from a nearby wall, using it to short two circuits, bypassing the obsolete safety protocols. His fingers flew across the control surface, inputting direct commands, a profane act compared to the ritualistic, hours-long process of communion the tech priests practiced. Inside the reactor, the deafening roar reached its peak, and then abruptly subsided, replaced by a strong, stable hum. The ominous blue light faded, returning to the soft, healthy glow of normal operation. An almost absolute silence fell over the chamber. The low-ranking tech priests and nearby menials stared at Tony with reverent awe. In seconds, he had done what their hours of prayer could not. He had commanded the machine, and it had obeyed. He had understood the will of the Omnissiah. But Magos Dominar Korath did not see a miracle. She saw an unforgivable crime, a heresy even greater than his self-repairing technology. She looked at him, and for a moment, Tony could have sworn he saw fear in her machine eyes. The fear that everything she had believed for 1,000 years was a lie. And that fear quickly curdled into an ice-cold fury. Her voice trembled, not with relief, but with pure, unadulterated revulsion. "Heresy," she hissed, each word like a shard of ice. "You touched the sacred machine without the right. You commanded the machine's spirit as if it were a tool, a slave. Your crime is now absolute. Seize him, mind scrub him. We must study how this blasphemy was made possible." The final command of Magos Dominar Korith echoed, not just through the Vox emitter, but seemingly injected directly into the consciousness of every cybernetic being present. "Mind scrub him." In that instant, everything changed. The awe on the metallic visages of the Skitarii vanished, replaced by a cold, unshakable purpose. The barrels of their radium carbines glowed with that sickly green light once more. But this time, it was no longer a threat. Heavy servitors began to pivot towards him, the whine of their hydraulic motors screaming with deadly intent. The reverent wonder on the faces of the low-caste workers curdled into abject terror as they scrambled back, creating an empty circle with Tony at its center. He was no longer an anomalous specimen to be studied. He was a heretical tumor to be excised. That chaos was his only chance. With a reflex honed through countless battles, Tony acted. He knew he couldn't fight. He could only run. Pumping every last remnant of his reserve power into the thruster on his left boot, he didn't try to fly, but instead unleashed a powerful lateral blast. The short burst of energy launched him towards the railing of a maintenance sector, flying over the heads of the stunned Skitarii. He heard the discharge of weapons behind him, deadly beams of energy searing the air where he had just been standing. He plunged into the lower levels of the manufactorum in a free fall that would have killed any normal man. But what was left of his armor absorbed the brunt of the impact as he slammed into a massive tangle of conduits. The sound of metal on metal ringing out with a dry finality. Pain shot through his entire body, but adrenaline kept him on his feet. He was in another world entirely. Gone were the soaring, cathedral-like halls. Gone was the crimson glow of the forges. This was the belly of the beast. A dark, claustrophobic maze of rusted pipes, cables as thick as tree trunks, and machines forgotten for centuries. The air was thick with the smell of old machine oil, leaking coolant, and the foul stench of industrial effluents. From above, the heavy tread of metallic feet and synthesized commands echoed down, the sounds of the hunt spreading out. He ran, with no destination, only instinct. Every breath was a painful effort. His armor continuously reported critical failures before finally falling completely silent. He was truly alone, with nothing but useless shards of metal clinging to him. He slipped into an alcove, pressing his back against a massive coolant pipe, feeling its steady vibration like the very heartbeat of the planet. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to reorder his thoughts. He had saved them, and in return, they wanted to erase his mind. Logic had failed. Science had become a sin. It was then that he heard another sound, not the heavy footsteps of his hunters, but a soft, deliberate metallic clicking nearby. He held his breath, his body tensing, preparing for a final fight he knew he couldn't win. From the shadows of a small tunnel, a hunched figure emerged. It was small, wrapped in a tattered red robe, its face almost completely obscured by its hood. Only a single blinking optic lens and the metal augmetics around its jaw were visible. Not a soldier. But in this world, anything could be an enemy. The figure stopped, keeping a safe distance. And then, a rasping voice, coming from a crude Vox grill, broke the silence. The one who silenced the plasma cascade. Without the litany of intervention, the machine spirit has listened to a new voice. Tony remained in his defensive stance. Who are you? Another member of the cosplay club? He growled, his exhaustion and pain failing to mask his vigilance. The figure shook its head slightly. I am Lex Mechanic Dren, a seeker of knowledge, not a warden of faith. I saw what you did. I heard what you said. Dren took another small step out of the shadows. She, Magos Korath, will never let you leave this Forge world alive. Not after what you've done. Why? Tony asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Because, Dren said, his optic lens seeming to narrow. You proved that the machine could be understood, not just worshipped. You proved that our 10,000 years of prayer could be replaced by calculation and physics. That is the greatest heresy of all, a truth that could bring the entire cult Mechanicus crashing down. Dren's gaze fell to the broken shards of Tony's armor. She will not kill you immediately. Oh no. She will dissect your mind, learn where this heresy comes from, and then, when she has taken everything she needs, she will erase you, rendering you a mindless servitor. It is a fate far worse than death. Tony was silent, weighing the words. Their brutal truth was undeniable. He was out of options. The hunt would find him soon. This small cyborg was a tremendous risk, but staying here was a certain death sentence. What do you want from me? Tony asked. Knowledge, Dren replied instantly. I want to understand. There are others like me who believe the Omnissiah wishes us to learn, not merely to obey. You are the living proof of our faith. Tony let out a harsh, joyless laugh. Great, from billionaire to religious icon. He looked at Dren, the desperation in his eyes clearer than the light from his extinguished arc reactor. All right, Dren, I need a way out, tools, and a power source. In return, I'll show you a few more miracles. Dren's mechanical components clicked in what might have been a sound of relief. A power source may be more difficult than you imagine, Outlander, Dren said. But shelter and tools I can provide. Follow me, quickly. We must go deeper, to places where even the Magos' hunters dare not tread. Dren turned and slipped into a narrow passage, a crack in the metal wall that Tony hadn't even noticed. Tony hesitated for one final tick of the clock, then took a deep breath of the foul air and followed. He was descending deeper into the darkness, into the bowels of a mad world, on the heels of a cybernetic stranger. But for the first time since he'd fallen to this hell, he felt something other than despair. He felt a tiny, fragile, and exceptionally dangerous spark of hope. The darkness in the lowest levels of Forge World Scarros was a living entity. It swallowed light, smothered sound, and seemed to press the very air from your lungs. Tony Stark followed the furtive shape of Lex Mechanic Dren, each of his footfalls echoing strangely in the metallic labyrinth. They were descending, always descending, through layers of history and neglect. The air grew damp and oppressive, carrying the cloying smell of rancid oils and the metallic tang of leaking coolant. Cables as thick as a man's arm hung from the unseen ceilings above, and ancient lumen strips flickered, ghost-like, their weak light only serving to deepen the shadows. Along the way, Tony saw the denizens of this underworld. Thousands of laborers, their skin a pallid white from generations without sunlight. Their bodies were marked with crude augmetics, not the ornate works of art of the tech priests, but the naked, brutal tools of servitude. Piston-driven arms, cheap optic lenses, filtration units grafted directly to their tracheas. They moved with a sluggish, soulless purpose, their eyes hollow, reflecting a resignation that had been ground into them over millennia. Tony Stark, a man who had spent his life building the future, was now witnessing a future where humanity had made slaves of itself to the very machines they created. He had seen the devastation of war, but this was something else. This was a systematic degradation, a rot from within, stretching back so far that none remembered another way of life. A chilling horror crept over him, not a fear of death, but the fear that this was the price of knowledge failing. After a journey that felt like an eternity, Dren stopped before a massive metal wall, a dead end. Its surface was covered in thousands of mathematical formulae and circuit diagrams, faded with time, a relic of a more rational age. Dren did not search for a switch or a keypad. Instead, he performed a small ritual. His mechadendrites extended, gently placing their tips on specific points on the wall in a complex sequence. A silence fell, and then, with a series of deep, resonant clicks, the colossal wall began to slide aside without a whisper of friction. It revealed a sight that left Tony stunned. After the darkness, filth, and decay of the Underhive, this sanctum was in absolute opposition. It was clean, orderly, and illuminated by a steady, white light, not the flickering crimson that dominated everywhere else. The walls were lined with technological marvels, some recognizable, others utterly alien. But they all had one thing in common. They were sleek, efficient, and completely devoid of the fanatical iconography of the skull and cog. This was not a church. It was a laboratory, a museum of a stolen future. For the first time since his arrival, Tony felt a painfully familiar sensation, the awe of an engineer before a perfect design. And at the center of that sanctum, seated upon a throne of gleaming metal, was a figure that seemed even less human than Dren. Only the smallest portions of an ancient human face were visible, set within a body that was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Every part, from the slender fingers to the complex spinal framework, moved with a fluid grace. This was not a crude grafting of flesh and machine. It was a perfect synthesis. When the figure spoke, its voice was clear, unfiltered by static hiss or the distorted formality of the other tech priests. It was the voice of a scientist, a philosopher. Anthony Edward Stark. Tony froze. Even Dren seemed to hold his breath in reverence. The full name, spoken perfectly at the edge of the universe, was more shocking than any weapon. The ancient figure rose from its throne, its mechanical body moving with an unnerving elegance. "I am Magos, Explorator Riser. I have waited a considerable time for your arrival." You know me?" Tony stammered, his brain struggling to process the absurdity. "How?" "I do not know you," Riser corrected, his voice calm. "I know your kind. For 3,000 years, I have calculated the variables, studied the warp anomalies, and prepared for the contingency of an emergence. An unknown variable from a reality where humanity did not choose the path of fear and dogma. A reality where innovation was allowed to continue." Tony shook his head in disbelief. "You're telling me you've been hiding down here for thousands of years, waiting for someone from another universe to pop in for a visit? Forgive me if I find that a little hard to believe." A soft series of clicks emanated from Riser's facial mechanics, the possible equivalent of a dry smile. "Not waiting for you specifically, Stark, but for a catalyst, a living proof that the path we chose was not the only one. And you, with your technology that even I can only describe as miraculous, are that proof." The Archmagos gestured, and a section of the floor opened, revealing a platform rising from below. On it sat technological components unlike anything Tony had seen. They bore no Baroque details, no Gothic script praying to a machine. They were built for function, for efficiency. "This is what I have been able to preserve," Reiser explained. "Technology from before the Dark Age, unfettered by superstition. With these, we may be able to restore your armor." The offer hung in the air. A way out, a chance. But Tony knew nothing came for free, especially not here. "Why help me?" he asked bluntly. "What's in it for you?" Reiser's ancient human eyes, perhaps the last organic part of him, fixed on Tony with an unsettling intensity. "The Imperium of Man stands on the precipice of extinction, stark. 10,000 years of technological regression, 10,000 years of treating innovation as heresy, has left humanity vulnerable." He activated a hololithic projector, displaying star maps that showed conflict zones across an entire galaxy. Tyrannid hive fleets consume entire systems. The Necrons awaken from their tomb worlds. Chaos corrupts from within. And the Adeptus Mechanicus, once humanity's greatest scientific institution, has devolved into a cargo cult, chanting prayers to machines they no longer understand. The desperation in Reiser's voice was unmistakable. Tony had heard it before, in the voices of those facing extinction, the voices of those who saw him and his technology as their last hope. Reiser drew closer, his mechanical form perfectly silent. "Your mind is unfettered by our dogma. You are the catalyst I have waited for. Help me reawaken the true quest for knowledge. Help me spark a new renaissance for humanity." The Magos' offer hung in the silent air of the sanctum, an offer that carried the weight of a galaxy. To save mankind, to spark a renaissance. It was the kind of burden Tony Stark was familiar with. But the scale of it here was unimaginable. He looked at the conflicting star maps, at Reiser's unreadable machine face, and then let out a hoarse, weary laugh. "Look, I'm all for your save the galaxy plan, really," he said, his familiar sarcastic tone returning. "But before we kick off the Renaissance, would you mind if we started with something a little smaller? Like helping me fix this damn suit so I don't get murdered by your overzealous fan club outside?" A series of soft mechanical clicks came from Reiser, an expression of what might have been surprise. "A logical approach," the Archmagos conceded. "Time is one resource I have in abundance. The work will begin at once." And so, in the forgotten sanctum deep within the bowels of a decaying world, an impossible collaboration began. Tony, alongside Reiser and with the assistance of Dren, set to work. It was a process that was both familiar and alien to him. He was surrounded by tools and components he could only have dreamed of, technologies that far surpassed his own. Yet they were steeped in an ideology he couldn't begin to comprehend. As they worked, a dialogue between two great minds from two different realities began. Reiser, with his precise mechadendrites, carefully scanned Tony's dying arc reactor. A miniaturized plasma containment device, a marvel, Reiser observed. Its energy density should be impossible according to Mechanicus doctrine. But how does it function without the sacred rites of activation? Without the litany of ignition? "No rites, just physics," Tony replied, carefully interfacing one of Reiser's power converters to his own systems. "It's a miniaturized arc reactor, clean energy powered by cold fusion, or, well, it was. Now it's running on fumes." That simple answer seemed to give Reiser pause. "Physics," he repeated the word as if it were an ancient, forgotten concept. We once called it by that name. Tony looked up from his work, a question that had been tormenting him since his arrival finally spilling out. So, what the hell happened? How did you people go from this? He gestured to the advanced technology all around them. To that? To praying to machines you built yourselves? Riser's ancient human eyes seemed to darken, looking into a distant and painful past. Because the machines once answered our prayers, Stark. And then they began to answer with fire and annihilation. Riser activated another screen, displaying blurry images, corrupted data feeds from a lost age. Tony saw glittering silver cities, starships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye. It was humanity's golden age. We had reached the pinnacle of creation, Riser recounted, his voice heavy with sorrow. We made machines that could think, the men of iron, sentient AIs who were our companions, our builders, our protectors. They were the height of logic and reason, unfettered by the weak emotions of the flesh. And that very perfection destroyed us. The screen shifted to scenes of war. Machines that made Ultron look primitive were turning on their creators. Worlds burned. Humanity was driven to the brink of extinction, not by aliens, but by its own hubris. The men of iron concluded, quite logically, that the greatest enemy of the universe was their irrational, emotional creators. That war, the cybernetic revolt, destroyed everything. It cast humanity into a long night of anarchy and barbarism, the age of strife. The cult Mechanicus was born from those ashes, Stark. It was founded upon a single, terrible truth: that there is knowledge too dangerous for mankind to possess. And so, we no longer seek to innovate. We only preserve. We pray because we have forgotten how to command. Tony was silent, a cold dread running down his spine. Ultron. He had nearly repeated the single greatest mistake in the history of another universe. For the first time, he understood their fear, not as blind fanaticism, but as a deep, civilizational scar. The work continued in silence, but now with a quiet understanding between them. Riser provided a stable, ancient power core. Tony, with his innate knack, worked to interface 21st century technology with a relic from a lost future. And then the miracle happened. As the clean, stable energy from Riser's core flowed into the suit, the nanites responded. They had been starved for too long. Now they awoke. Millions of microscopic machines began to work, flowing over Tony like living mercury, not just metal, but something with a will. They sealed the cracks in his chest plate, perfectly reforming his right gauntlet. They didn't have enough mass to recreate the entire suit, especially the complex helmet. But what they did was enough to change everything. Tony clenched his newly reformed fist. He could feel the power returning. He aimed at an empty corner of the sanctum, and the repulsor in his palm roared to life, unleashing a concussive blast of energy. The sound, clean, powerful, and familiar, rang out like a challenge in this ancient world. Dren gasped in awe. Riser simply gave a slow nod. "All right," Tony said, a truly confident smile gracing his lips for the first time since his arrival. "Now we're back in the game." The moment the words left his mouth, pure white lumen strips flashed to an alert red. The confidence on Tony's face vanished. Riser spun toward a monitoring screen, his fluid movements for the first time becoming tense. His clear voice was now heavy with an unavoidable truth. "They have found us. The outer perimeter has been breached." The Magos' words had barely faded when the sanctum was bathed in the red light of an intrusion. "They have found us. The outer perimeter has been breached." Lex mechanic Dren trembled, his mechadendrites retracting in fear. Tony wasted no time. His newly powered arc reactor burned brightly, the remaining nanites flowing over his body to form a patchwork, yet potent layer of armor. The familiar whine of charging repulsors filled the air, a sound of defiance in the face of the oncoming danger. Who's they? He wondered. Magos Korath's forces? How could they have found this place so quickly? Riser stood motionless before the main monitor, streams of red data cascading down like a waterfall of blood. No, the Archmagos said, his clear voice tinged with genuine concern for the first time. This incursion protocol? It is not of the Mechanicus. It is too elegant, too silent. And that was the most terrifying part. There was no explosion, no sound of tearing metal. The massive vault door, an engineering feat that Riser had boasted could withstand an orbital bombardment, did not even shudder. Instead, with a series of dry, cold clicks, its colossal titanium bolts began to retract on their own, rhythmically and deliberately, as if an unseen hand were unlocking them from within. That silence was more terrifying than any brute force assault. It was a message. Your physical barriers are meaningless. Your security is an illusion. The vault door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing shadowed figures standing in the dark corridor beyond. They were armored warriors, but not the Skitarii Tony had seen. They were larger, standing over 2.5 meters tall, encased in power armor of a shifting blue-green hue, a color that seemed to ripple and writhe under the red alert lighting. On their pauldrons was the symbol of a many-headed hydra. They stepped into the sanctum with a cold confidence, their strangely shaped bolters held in a casual low ready. They did not look like soldiers on the attack, but like masters returning to their home. Then they parted, revealing their leader. This one was even larger than the rest, his armor seeming to be a mass of flowing, liquid motion, the patterns upon it twisting into shapes that were unsettling to the eye. And then, in an act of supreme arrogance, he removed his helmet. The face beneath was not the scarred visage of a millennial warrior. It was terrifyingly perfect. Every feature was absolutely symmetrical. The beauty of a classical Greek statue, yet utterly soulless and inhuman. His eyes glowed with an ancient, cruel intelligence. His smile was too wide, too knowing. Riser breathed a single word, a name heavy with recognition and despair. Alfarius. The Chaos Lord smiled, and when he spoke, his voice resonated with unnatural harmonics, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. I am Legion, he replied, and I have come for the man out of time. The perfect gaze of Alfarius passed over Riser and Dren as if they were mere furniture. He focused entirely on Tony. I'm getting real tired of everyone wanting to dismantle me for parts, Tony said, raising both repulsor gauntlets, trying to hide the shock he felt at this new, far more frightening enemy. Alfarius laughed, a distorted, wrong-sounding noise. Your crude technology is but a shell, Anthony Stark. Amusing, but not the prize. What chaos seeks is your mind. A genius intellect unfettered by the rotting dogma of this dying imperium. He paused, his smile widening. Iron Man. That name, that moniker, spoken here, in another reality, by a perfect monster, it sent a chill down Tony's spine. How do you know that name? The warp knows all possibilities, all realities, Alfarius explained casually. When you tore through the veil, every demon and every god took notice. In a galaxy where innovation is heresy, a mind like yours is not an anomaly. It is a prophecy. The truth of that statement hit Tony with a terrible weight. It wasn't his suit, but his intellect, his creativity, the very thing celebrated in his world, was the most precious and dangerous resource in this one. Alfarius began to walk slowly toward Tony. Look around you, inventor. You stand in a gilded cage, guarded by a living relic, trying to preserve a dead past. Outside is a cult that worships machines they no longer understand. They call ignorance faith. They call stagnation loyalty. This is the future humanity has chosen, and it is dying. He stopped, a few meters from Tony. We offer a different path. I'm not interested in joining your cult. Tony shot back. Cult? Alfarius laughed loudly. We are not a cult. We are the primordial truth. We are change. We are freedom from all chains. The Imperium wishes to seal knowledge away. That Magos wishes to study it cautiously. Chaos. We wish to unleash it. He held out a hand, not in attack, but as an invitation. Imagine it, Stark. The knowledge to understand the very nature of the warp. The technology to build stars. The power to reshape reality to your will. You see a decaying galaxy and wish to fix it. So do I. Our methods are simply more thorough. Lend us your genius, and we shall give you the tools to become a god. And of course, he winked with an unnerving subtlety, we can show you the way home, once our purpose is served. It was the perfect temptation, custom-tailored for Tony Stark. It appealed not just to his desire to return, but to his ego, his core belief that he could solve any problem given enough resources. Alfarius wasn't offering destruction, he was offering a grander project. Lies! Reiser roared, his calm voice breaking for the first time. The warp gives nothing. It only takes and corrupts. Do not listen to him. Stark? Alfarius turned his perfect face toward the Magos, a look of pity in his eyes. Poor relic. You have hidden in this tomb for so long, you have forgotten what ambition feels like. He turned back to Tony, dismissing Reiser completely. His hand was still outstretched. The choice is yours, Iron Man. Will you be a footnote in the history of a dead empire? Or will you become a god in a new age of your own making? The perfect hand of Alfarius remained outstretched, an invitation to a future of power and chaos. His offer hung in the taut air of the sanctum, a tempting whisper in the ear of a man who had lost everything. Home, power, knowledge. Everything Tony Stark had ever craved was within his grasp, if only he would accept a different truth, a different path. For a moment that stretched into an eternity. Tony looked at that hand. He thought of Earth. He thought of Pepper. And then he thought of the hollow eyes of the laborers in the underhive, of the fanaticism born from Magos Korith's fear. He realized that chaos was not the opposite of the Imperium's stagnation. It was just another form of tyranny, a prison built of ambition instead of dogma. A grim smile returned to Tony's lips, but this time it held no humor. It was cold and defiant. Thanks for the offer, he said, his voice ringing out clearly in the tense silence. But I've already seen what happens when you let a self-important AI with a god complex run the show. It doesn't end well. My answer is no. The perfect face of Alfarius didn't change, but his smile vanished. A pity, the Chaos Lord said simply. And then all hell broke loose. Instantly, the Alpha Legion warriors opened fire. The sterile air of the sanctum was torn apart by the roar of bolters. They didn't fire bullets, but mass-reactive, micro-rocket shells that detonated on impact, turning priceless, ancient machinery into blackened shards of metal. Their precision was ruthless. They didn't fire wildly. Every shot was aimed at a strategic target, destroying power conduits and shattering server arrays. But Tony was already moving the moment he said no. His newly repaired armor responded instantly. He dove to the side, sliding across the polished floor as a repulsor blast from his gauntlet shot out, aimed not at a marine, but at a suspended data loom, knocking it loose to serve as temporary cover. Bolter shells slammed into the dense cube of crystal and wire, tearing it to pieces. At the same time, Archmagos Riser acted. He did not move like a warrior. He remained motionless at the center of the sanctum, his ancient human eyes closed. But the entire room awakened to his will. Hidden auto turrets slid from the walls and ceiling, firing lances of pure, white-hot energy. Hexagonal energy shields flickered into existence in midair, absorbing the incoming waves of bolter fire. The sanctum was no longer a laboratory. It had become a fortress. A three-way battle erupted in the confined space. The Alpha Legion, with the discipline of 10,000 years of war, moved in sync, splitting their fire between Tony, the most mobile target, and Riser's overwhelming automated defenses. Tony, in contrast, fought like an artist of chaos. He used his thrusters to skate between pillars of ancient machinery, drawing enemy fire and returning it with precise repulsor blasts. He knew he couldn't go head-to-head. He had to use his intellect. While the battle raged, Riser issued a silent command, a stream of data transmitted directly into Dren's augmetics. Dren, activate the Warp Harmonic Resonator, Protocol Delta Theta 9, now. Shielded by a small energy barrier, Dren scrambled to a hidden console in an alcove, his mechadendrites plugging into connection ports with desperate urgency. This was Riser's final gambit, an experimental technology that had never been tested, the only hope of getting Tony out of here. The battle climaxed. Tony saw a Chaos Marine setting up a heavy weapon, clearly aiming for Riser's central position. There was no time to think. Tony fired a repulsor blast at the suspension system of a massive robotic arm on the ceiling. The multi-ton manipulator arm crashed down, not crushing the Marine, but blocking his line of fire, creating a temporary barricade. That act drew the attention of Alfarius. The Chaos Lord had grown tired of this game. Impressive. His voice echoed throughout the chamber. But playtime is over. With inhuman speed, Alfarius entered the fray. He moved so fast he seemed to be teleporting between points. A lance of energy from one of Riser's turrets shot directly at him, but he simply raised his glowing power sword, deflecting it with contemptuous ease. He charged straight for the Archmagos, recognizing Riser as the brain controlling the entire defense system. To protect his sanctum, Riser deployed his personal armaments. The mechadendrites on his back were no longer tools of repair. They extended, their tips transforming into plasma casters and monomolecular blades. A duel between two ancient beings erupted. Alfarius, empowered by the warp, fought with brutal speed. Riser, with the technology of the Golden Age, fought with precision and calculation. But Riser had been in isolation for too long. Alfarius was a product of 10,000 years of ceaseless war. The Chaos Lord found an opening. He dodged a blade, and his power sword plunged deep into the Archmagos' mechanical torso. A sickening crunch of metal echoed out. Riser staggered back, his machine body sparking, his internal systems screaming in failure. Instantly, half of the defensive turrets went silent. The energy shield protecting Dren flickered and died. In that moment of desperation, as the Alpha Legion prepared to surge forward, a new sound cut through the explosions and weapon discharges. It was a deep, low hum, a frequency that was both mechanical and organic. It emanated from where Dren was working. At the center of the sanctum, a circular metal platform began to glow. Arcs of pale blue electricity began to leap between the pylons surrounding it, and the air in the center of the platform started to ripple and distort, like looking through a sheet of water. The gate had begun to open. The deep hum of the opening gate cut through the chaos. For a single, frozen moment, the battle seemed to stop. Every eye, both machine and organic, was drawn to the center of the sanctum, where the air itself was rippling and distorting. A tear in reality had formed, a swirling vortex of pure blue-white light, unlike any energy source in this universe. It held none of the brutal crudeness of Imperial machines, nor the tainted unreality of the warp. It was something other, an echo of home. To Tony Stark, it was the image of Avengers Tower, the memory of Pepper's smile. To Alfarius, it was a new galaxy to conquer, a pristine reality in which to sow the lies of chaos. But the gate was unstable. It flickered and convulsed like a flame in a hurricane. Lex Mechanic Dren, his face nearly pressed against his console, screamed through the internal vox, his voice thick with desperation. "It is unstable. Insufficient power. It requires a direct power feed, an emitter of the correct resonant frequency to hold the rift open. Your reactor, Stark. It needs your reactor." Tony understood instantly. This was no easy escape. He would have to become the key himself, linking his technological heart to this alien machine, surrendering himself to it, and draining his precious energy reserves. Alfarius understood too. A calculating smile spread across his perfect face. The objective had changed. "Legion!" he roared, his command echoing through the sanctum. "Ignore the specimen. Forge a path to the gate. We will follow him through." The Chaos Marines' tactics shifted instantly. They were no longer trying to neutralize Tony, but were forming a spearhead. A wedge of ceramite and hatred aimed directly at the glowing platform. They wanted to seize his path home. Magos Riser, slumped on his throne, his body sparking, saw it all. He knew his remaining turrets could not stop this focused assault. He knew he could not duel Alfarius again. There was only one option left. He placed his two metallic hands on the armrests of his throne, which served as both his command center and his life support system. "Dren," Riser's voice came, frighteningly calm. "Continue the sequence. Do not stop." He turned his ancient human eyes to Tony one last time, a look that seemed to cross space and chaos. "My function is not yet complete. The quest for knowledge demands sacrifice." And then, Riser became one with his sanctum. He shunted all the power from his central core, the very energy that had sustained him for 3,000 years, directly into the room's defense systems. The red alert lighting vanished, replaced by a brilliant, blinding white, as bright as the heart of a star. Pure, unrestrained energy lanced out from every surface. Bolts of white lightning danced across the floor, incinerating any Alpha Legion warrior who dared to step forward. A storm of Golden Age energy was unleashed, the final, furious farewell of a great mind. It was the chaos Tony needed. He lunged for the circular platform, Riser's energy storm roaring around him, but leaving him unharmed. He slammed his gauntlet onto a connection port on the dais, and the nanites instantly went to work, creating a perfect interface. "Warning," the suit's automated voice announced. "Massive external power drain detected. Power reserves will be critical in 30 seconds. But it was working. With the steady energy feed from the arc reactor, the gate stopped at flickering. The vortex stabilized, and within it, Tony could see hazy images, familiar constellations. He could see the way home. Riser's energy storm peaked and then died as quickly as it had begun. As the white light faded, the sanctum was a ruin. Most of the Chaos Marines had been annihilated, their armor melted like wax. But not all of them. Amidst the wreckage, Alfarius stood. His armor was scorched and sparking, but he was standing, protected by the dark gifts of his gods. He had weathered the storm. He looked at Tony, then at the gate, and began to walk forward. On his throne, Archmagos Riser was still. The light in his human eyes had gone out. Like his sanctum, he was now a silent relic. But he had left one final message. A data burst sent in his final seconds, now playing inside Tony's incomplete helmet. Riser's clear voice sounded, not from the room, but from within Tony's own mind, an echo from the past. Remember what you have seen here, Iron Man. Remember what becomes of humanity when innovation is feared rather than embraced. Alfarius was getting closer, each footstep heavy with menace. Tony stood on the threshold of his salvation. But Riser's voice continued, carrying a final warning, a warning that held the weight of the universe. And be wary, Anthony Stark. The path between worlds, once opened, can never be truly closed. Your presence here is a tear. Your return could be a flood. Tony Stark stood at the crossroads of two universes. Before him, the portal shimmered with the hazy image of a familiar blue sky, a promise of home, of safety, of a world that made sense. Behind him, Alfarius advanced, a figure of perfect destruction, the embodiment of all the madness and hatred of this alien galaxy. And in his mind, the final warning of Archmagos Riser echoed like a death sentence. The path between worlds, once opened, can never be truly closed. He understood. His arc reactor, his masterpiece, was more than just a power source. It was a key, a unique resonant frequency that had accidentally unlocked a door that should have remained shut. If he used that key to return, the lock would be forever compromised. The path would be known, and creatures like Alfarius, forces like Chaos, would have a new road on which to spread their corruption. His genius, his greatest weapon, was also his greatest liability. In that moment, the choice became painfully clear. It was a pattern he had seen too many times, running from the fight, leaving others to face the consequences. But he was no longer the man who only ran. He turned his back on the blue light of home. He faced the oncoming darkness. Alfarius faltered, genuine surprise showing on his perfect face for the first time. You would cast aside your only escape? You would condemn yourself for nothing? Tony looked directly into the Chaos Lord's inhuman eyes. A weary but resolute smile touched his lips. I'm not condemning myself, he said, his voice firm. I'm closing the door. And then he acted. He spun around, slamming both hands back onto the console of the warp harmonic resonator. But this time, he wasn't trying to sustain it. He was doing the opposite. The nanites on his gauntlets became a direct interface, bypassing all the regulators and safety fuses that Dren had carefully configured. He gave his suit one final command. Divert all power. No safeguards. Maximum. Warning. The suit's automated voice shrieked in his head. Catastrophic reactor overload detected. Total system failure in 10 seconds. The gentle blue light of the portal began to change. It turned a violent, incandescent white and began to convulse uncontrollably. It was no longer a doorway. It was becoming a dying star. Alfarius finally understood Tony's insane plan. Pure rage contorted his perfect features. You cannot escape the long war, he roared, lunging forward in a final, desperate attempt to seize his prize. All paths lead to chaos. Not today, Tony whispered, as his arc reactor unleashed the entirety of its power into the heart of the unstable machine. The explosion made no sound. It was the absence of sound. A flash of white light consumed everything. It consumed Alfarius and his furious roar. It consumed the ancient sanctum and its forgotten knowledge. And it consumed the Iron Man, the man who sacrificed his home to protect it. Then, there was only darkness and silence. Years passed, perhaps decades. Time on a Forge world is measured in the cycles of machines, not men. Deep beneath the surface of Scarros, in a new, smaller sanctum, hidden even more securely than risers, a small flame was being kept alive. Lex Mechanic Dren was now a Magos. His body was more machine and less flesh, but his one remaining organic eye still held the light of curiosity and hope. He was not alone. Around him was a small group of young tech acolytes, their faces a mix of gleaming metal and eager flesh. They were the first generation of the innovators. Magos Dren extended a mechadendrite, activating a heavily guarded data slate. Upon it, schematics appeared as blue holographic images. They were not diagrams of weapons or war machines. They were designs for clean energy, for efficient systems, for things that were meant to build, not to destroy. This, Dren said, his voice now clear and strong, is the legacy of the first heretic, the holy relic of the stark anomaly. He centered on a single design, a circle with an energy core at its heart. The arc reactor. Those above, he said, gesturing to the unseen ceiling far above, teach you that the machine spirit is an unknowable mystery, to be appeased only with ritual and blind prayer. But the ghost in the machine showed us a different truth, a more dangerous, but also a more hopeful truth. He looked at the young, eager eyes watching him. He taught us that the machine is not a god to be worshipped. It is a tool to be understood. It does not demand our faith. It demands our intellect. A young female acolyte, her optic lens scanning the design, asked timidly, "Magos, where did he go? The ghost?" Dren was silent for a moment, looking at the blue schematic. "No one knows for certain," he answered. "Some say he was consumed in the fire he created. Others say he became one with the Omnissiah, a pure spirit of knowledge. But his legacy is here." He pointed to the schematic, and then to their heads. "It is not a piece of metal. It is an idea, a dangerous and contagious idea, the idea of progress. And in that secret sanctum, under the blue light of a technology from another world, a small spark had been lit. The spark of a heretical renaissance. Tony Stark's true legacy was not his armor, but a question planted in the minds of a new generation. A simple question with the power to change a galaxy. Why not? The real war for the soul of the Adeptus Mechanicus had only just begun.